My name is Ethan Caldwell, and until last November, I was the lead compliance officer for a logistics firm based out of Chicago. 15 years. That's how long I gave that company. 15 years of 60-hour weeks, red-eye flights, late-night policy rewrites, and weekend audits. No fanfare, no spotlight, just quiet, consistent work that kept our operations legal and our contracts intact. So when I got the calendar invite for a quick sync on a Tuesday morning, I didn't think much of it. My boss, Clarissa, had a habit of dropping in unannounced like that. I assumed it was about the new vendor contract I flagged the week before, one that had some language I didn't like. But when I joined the Zoom call, her face was already tight. HR was there too. Dan, someone I'd only met twice, already had that awkward, too polite expression on his face. "Ethan," Clarissa began, "we appreciate your many years of service, but as part of a broader restructuring initiative, your position is being eliminated effective immediately." No warning, no prior meetings, just those words. My audio was still muted. Dan chimed in, offering some legalese about severance and transition support, but I couldn't hear a word. I just stared at their faces in those little rectangles. People I'd given years of my life to, now watching me get erased through a screen. I clicked Leave Meeting without saying a thing. Didn't even grab the PDF severance packet until hours later. I didn't yell, I didn't call anyone. I just sat there in my home office, surrounded by the quiet buzz of the computer fan and the faint hum of the city outside. I'd just been fired by people I'd helped protect from millions in fines. People who knew damn well that I was the one who'd quietly cleaned up messes no one else even saw coming. Clarissa had always said I was too thorough, that I took things too seriously. What she really meant was that I documented everything. Every inconsistency, every override, every suspicious edit to vendor terms or backdated approval. And because I was too polite to push hard, they assumed I'd go quietly. But they didn't know I kept copies. Not on the company cloud, of course. I wasn't stupid. But over the years, I'd created private archives, versions of key policy documents, contract drafts, and compliance memos. Not because I was paranoid, but because it was just good practice. Call it a habit born from risk management. You don't survive 15 years in corporate compliance without backup plans. The week before they fired me, I'd flagged a procurement deal that didn't make sense. New vendor, inflated shipping rates, and a fast-tracked approval from someone 3 levels above my pay grade. I documented my concerns in an internal memo, sent it through the proper channels, and never heard back. Until now. They didn't fire me because of budget cuts. They fired me because I knew too much. What they didn't realize, what they'd never considered, is that the boring compliance guy they just erased from the org chart was the same guy who had quietly saved the company from 3 federal audits, 2 breach disclosures, and 1 very ugly non-disclosure scandal they were lucky never made the papers. So, I did what I always do when things go sideways. I made a plan. Because they started this. And I always finish what started. I didn't tell my wife right away. Melissa was in the kitchen making breakfast for the kids, humming to herself, completely unaware that everything had just changed. I sat at the dining table, sipping cold coffee, the taste flat in my mouth. There's no good way to say, "Hey, I just got fired over Zoom by people I trained." So I waited. I waited until the kids were off to school and the house was quiet. Then I told her. She stared at me for a long second, like she didn't quite hear me right. Then she asked what happened. I told her the truth. Not all of it, not yet, but enough. She was angry, not at me, but for me. Said we should call a lawyer, said we should go public, but I shook my head. Not yet. I've never been the guy who reacts. I observe, I take notes, I listen when people think no one's paying attention. That's how I'd survived for so long. That's how I knew that what happened wasn't just some restructuring. It was a surgical removal, the kind that happens when someone doesn't want questions asked. I pulled out an old notebook from the bookshelf in my office, a real one, paper, ink, tabs. I flipped through the pages until I found what I was looking for. Notes from a Q4 compliance meeting 2 years ago. Names, dates, contracts. Procurement revisions that were pushed through for speed. I'd written it all down. Back then, it didn't mean much. Now, it looked like the beginning of a pattern. They didn't just get rid of me. They were scrubbing history. So, I spent the rest of the week going through my backups, quietly, thoroughly. I pulled the flagged vendor contracts, the metadata of who edited what and when, the chain of approvals that didn't match policy. Every time someone had circumvented the process, I had a record of it. They assumed I'd forget. They didn't know I had my own version control, my own digital breadcrumbs. I found something strange. The vendor I'd flagged, the one with the bloated logistics contract, was listed under a new name in a separate region of our internal directory. Same address, same tax ID, different branding. It had been masked, like someone tried to bury it under another division's umbrella. That's when I knew this went higher than Clarissa. Someone was running a shadow vendor setup, fake competition, real payouts. And Clarissa? She was just protecting her peace. I reached out to my old friend Marcos, a cybersecurity analyst I'd worked with back when we handled that NDA breach. He now consulted for a private investigations firm in Seattle. I didn't give details, just told him I needed help tracing internal routing and masked invoice trails. He agreed without hesitation, said he'd look into the company name and ping me in a few days. Meanwhile, I reviewed my severance packet. I hadn't signed anything yet, and that turned out to be a good thing. One of the clauses, buried deep in the legalese, tried to block me from possessing, discussing, or referencing internal documentation in perpetuity. That's not standard language. That's fear. They were afraid of what I knew, and I was just getting started. Late one night, while Melissa and the kids were asleep, I opened a new document on my personal laptop. I titled it simply, Audit Trail, Private Use Only. Then I started writing everything. From the day I noticed something off in that vendor invoice, to the exact moment I got cut loose on a Tuesday morning. I wasn't going to confront anyone, not yet. I was going to finish documenting everything. Because if there's one thing I learned in 15 years of corporate compliance, it's this: the truth doesn't just come out. You have to build a path for it. And I was laying the foundation, one piece at a time. 3 days after I got let go, Marcos called. He'd stayed up late cross-referencing the vendor I flagged, Aerobridge Logistics, with government contractor databases and private sector registration logs. What he found made my stomach sink. Aerobridge had been renamed 3 times in the past 4 years. Same legal entity, same mailing address in Omaha, Nebraska, but each time the branding changed, it was awarded a new contract under a different name. The kicker, each contract came from the same department inside our company, Global Supply Chain Operations. I hadn't worked directly under that division in years, but I knew who ran it. His name was Grayson Bell, Executive VP. One of those polished, smooth-talking operators with perfect suits and vague answers. He'd been promoted 2 years ago, around the same time the contracts started quietly doubling in value. And guess who Grayson used to work with? Clarissa. Suddenly, it all snapped into place. I wasn't let go because of performance. I was removed because I had connected 2 dots someone desperately wanted left alone. I spent the weekend going back through old email threads, trying to jog my memory. I remembered a meeting from almost a year ago. There'd been whispers about speeding up invoice approvals. Operational urgency was the phrase they used. I'd pushed back, requested clarification, asked for a proper audit trail. Clarissa had shut it down with a smile and a thinly veiled reminder to pick my battles. I picked one. Apparently, it was the wrong one. But now, with distance, I could see the whole map forming. Aerobridge wasn't just a logistics provider. It was a shell, and someone inside our company was funneling payments through it. I opened a spreadsheet and started building a timeline. I aligned contract approvals with promotion dates, financial performance dips, and email threads. Patterns emerged. Aerobridge contracts always showed spikes in Q4, the same quarter we'd been scrambling to meet compliance standards and tighten margins. Someone had been hiding those expenses under the rug, betting no one would look too closely. They were wrong. I found an old procurement email chain from 2 years back. Buried deep in the attachment history was a file I'd never opened. It was an internal quote comparison showing Aerobridge was 28% more expensive than the next vendor. But the cheaper option had a handwritten note in the margin. Too slow, not agile enough. It had been rejected without formal review. The handwriting was Clarissa's. I printed it. I printed everything. Meanwhile, Marcos discovered something else. Aerobridge shared a P.O. box with another firm, Evermont Strategies. No public affiliation, no overlap on paper. But when he ran a forensic DNS lookup, the same IT administrator had registered both companies' web domains. And the account admin belonged to an email registered under Grayson Bell's name. This was no coincidence. It was laundering. Not of money exactly, but of legitimacy. Creating the illusion of choice, hiding cost inflation behind shell firms, inflating contracts to pad someone's bonus structure, probably tied to vendor growth metrics. They'd used my own department to sign off on the early-stage paperwork, back when it was just small increases, back when no one thought to ask questions, back when I was still trusted. But they underestimated me, because while they were gaming the system, I was building an archive. And it wasn't just metadata and emails now, it was motive, method, and connection. The next move had to be precise. I wasn't going to make noise. That's what they'd expect. Some ex-employee with a grudge waving documents and shouting into the void. No, I had something better. I had their own policies, their own audit requirements, their own signatures on approvals they never should have authorized. The deeper I dug, the more obvious it became. This wasn't sloppy. This was orchestrated. And I wasn't the only one who could blow it open. I knew from the start that if I made this personal, I'd lose. People like Clarissa and Grayson survive on chaos. They know how to twist emotion into recklessness, how to spin every accusation into a disgruntled former employee just lashing out. So I didn't shout, I didn't post, I didn't threaten. I got strategic. The first thing I did was secure everything. I backed up the archive to 3 separate encrypted drives, 1 physical, 2 cloud-based under aliases. Marcos helped me set up a failsafe. If anything happened to me or my data, those archives would automatically forward to 3 different recipients: my attorney, a reporter I trusted from my previous work on ethics panels, and a federal oversight contact I'd quietly stayed in touch with over the years. Then I started reviewing Meridian's own corporate ethics policies. I knew every clause, every loophole, every line item that the board had pushed to protect themselves after a smaller scandal back in 2016. The irony wasn't lost on me. The very protocols I helped write were now the tools I'd use to expose them. Clarissa had insisted on annual ethics certifications for every employee. I still had the 2023 version she signed. In it, she explicitly declared that all vendors had been vetted and that no conflicts of interest existed in her reporting structure. That would be hard to explain now, considering she was greenlighting contracts tied to her old colleague's shadow company. Grayson's bonus history was even more revealing. In 2 years, his compensation had nearly doubled, on paper, because of vendor diversification savings. Except those diverse vendors were just different faces of the same operation. If I could prove it, I could show intent, not mismanagement, fraud. I wasn't aiming for Clarissa anymore. I was going after the whole machine. But I needed access to more than just emails and vendor data. I needed board-level eyes. I remembered a name, Walter Deakins. He was on the audit committee, semi-retired, the kind of old-school executive who still believed in order and reputation. Years ago, I'd helped his team quietly handle a conflict of interest complaint that could have embarrassed the company. He trusted me then. Maybe he still did. I found his personal assistant's contact on LinkedIn, sent a simple message. Have important and time-sensitive information regarding vendor fraud. Requesting private audience with Mr. Deakins. Discretion critical. Ethan Caldwell. 20 minutes later, I got a reply. Mr. Deakins is available Thursday morning, 10 a.m. Private office, no company systems. Perfect. While I waited, I kept digging. Marcos helped me trace 2 additional vendor aliases, both with inflated logistics pricing and indirect links to Grayson's financial consultant. We found a pattern of PO adjustments that always happened right before quarterly earnings calls. That's how they did it. They loaded costs when no one was looking, then rolled them back after reporting, using phantom invoices. That was earnings manipulation. Securities fraud. Now we weren't just talking about internal policy violations. We were talking about federal charges. I had everything I needed. But before I walked into that meeting with Deakins, I prepared one final insurance policy. I wrote a formal whistleblower disclosure under SEC Rule 21F17, which protects individuals exposing corporate fraud tied to public financial misrepresentation. I didn't send it yet, but it was ready. By Thursday morning, I'd printed a copy of the report, 37 pages, cross-indexed, labeled, easy to read but hard to deny. I wore a suit I hadn't touched in years, no tie, just a clean, sharp look, the kind that says, I'm not bitter, I'm not broken, I'm in control. Because I was. They had no idea what was coming, and by the time they did, it would be too late to stop it. Thursday morning, I walked into Walter Deakins' private office with a black binder under my arm and a calm I hadn't felt in weeks. He stood when I entered, mid-70s, white hair like steel wool, eyes sharp behind gold-rimmed glasses. He didn't waste time with pleasantries, just gestured to the chair across from him. "Talk to me," he said. I handed him the binder. "I'm not here for my job back," I began. "I'm here because Meridian's Q4 reports were manipulated, vendor contracts were falsified, and 2 executives are running a shell company for profit while burying costs inside the supply chain budget." He opened the binder, flipping through the first few pages. "Everything is sourced," I said. "Emails, metadata, routing slips, procurement edits. I didn't steal anything. These are copies of files I had access to in the normal course of my role, all compiled after my termination." He looked up. "Who else knows?" "Just you and one cybersecurity consultant helping me confirm the digital trails. But I've prepared disclosures for the SEC and DOJ. I haven't filed them yet." Deakins nodded slowly. "You understand the gravity of what you're saying." "I do." He didn't ask why I was doing this. That was the thing about men like Deakins. When presented with truth, their first instinct wasn't to question motives, it was to verify risk. He spent 30 minutes flipping through the binder in silence. Occasionally, his lips tightened or he muttered under his breath. When he reached the final section, Grayson's bonus structure tied to vendor savings that didn't exist, he snapped the folder shut. "I'll handle this," he said. That was all I needed to hear. I stood, shook his hand, and walked out of the building without looking back. Later that afternoon, things started to move. First, I got an email from Marcos with an attachment, a full breakdown of the shell companies registered under aliases connected to Aerobridge. One of them had a mailing address that belonged to a P.O. box listed under a dummy foundation, run by Grayson's cousin. The fraud was deeper than I thought. I updated my file, quietly sent Deakins a digital copy of the extended findings. By Friday morning, rumors were swirling. An internal audit had been launched. HR put a freeze on all vendor contract renewals. Clarissa canceled a leadership town hall due to unforeseen circumstances. And Grayson, he went dark. I didn't celebrate. Not yet. Because I knew people like them don't fold on day one. They regroup, they strategize, they retaliate. So I stayed ahead of them. I got a call that evening from an unknown number. I let it ring through. The voicemail came seconds later. "Ethan, it's Clarissa. We should talk. I think there's been a misunderstanding." She sounded calm, but I could hear the panic beneath it, the slow, careful enunciation of someone trying not to sound guilty. I didn't call back. Instead, I forwarded the voicemail to Deacons. Saturday morning, the first public crack appeared. Meridian's compliance website posted a bland update. Routine audit review underway, initiated by the board. Corporate speak for "something's wrong and we're trying to control the narrative." But the wheels were in motion. By Monday, Grayson was placed on temporary leave. Clarissa was cooperating with an inquiry. A subcommittee was formed to review vendor procurement protocols. It was a quiet purge, but a purge nonetheless. And I wasn't finished. I filed my formal whistleblower disclosure with the SEC, attached everything, kept it clinical, precise, no emotion, no vengeance, just facts. Because the truth doesn't need rage to be powerful. It just needs to be undeniable. By Wednesday, the company newsletter skipped its usual fluff about promotions and birthdays. Instead, there was a terse announcement. Effective immediately, Grayson Bell has resigned from his position as Executive Vice President of Global Supply Chain. An interim leader will be announced shortly. No mention of why. No mention of the investigation. But I knew, and so did Walter Deacons. What they didn't expect, what maybe even Deacons hadn't fully realized, was that my disclosure to the SEC had triggered a parallel response. The agency didn't just sit on it. Within days, they reached out for supporting documentation, asked for a formal interview, and opened a preliminary investigation into Meridian's procurement process and Q4 earnings reports. I made it clear that I wasn't looking for a payout or reinstatement. I wanted accountability. I wanted names on paper, people answering questions under oath, not hiding behind strategic departures and internal memos. Clarissa was still holding on. She hadn't resigned, not yet, but she was quieter now. Her internal communications grew sparse. Her calendar cleared. I heard through a former coworker that she looked tired, jumpier than usual, taking meetings behind closed doors, refusing to sign off on even routine policy updates. It wouldn't be long now. Then the final blow came from a place I hadn't anticipated. An internal whistleblower from Clarissa's own team. Someone I didn't know personally. Lisa, mid-level compliance analyst. She'd found an email buried in Clarissa's drafts folder. It had never been sent. A message to Grayson outlining strategy to isolate risk exposure by removing high-visibility compliance roles before Q4 reviews. That role? Mine. Lisa took screenshots, forwarded them to Deacons. And Deacons? He sent them straight to the board. By the following Monday, Clarissa's name was gone from the executive roster. Another quiet exit. Another pursuing new opportunities email that fooled no one. But the damage was done. The board launched a full forensic audit. The SEC began interviewing other employees. Former vendors were contacted, asked to verify contract terms and rate structures. One of them, apparently unaware of the deeper game, admitted to being approached by a consultant 2 years ago who encouraged them to rebrand under a new name in exchange for expedited approvals. That consultant? Grayson's cousin. Everything was unraveling. The house of cards they'd built on shadows and shortcuts was collapsing under its own weight. And I didn't have to lift a finger anymore. Just had to keep supplying what I already had. Copies, records, quiet truths that no one could explain away. I watched the fallout from a distance. Marcos kept me updated on the technical side. The internal routing logs we'd pulled showed systemic abuse, cost masking, duplicate approvals, metadata tampering. evidence not just of poor oversight, but coordinated deceit. My attorney, once skeptical, now called me weekly with updates from the SEC. Apparently, they were preparing a referral to the DOJ. That meant criminal charges were likely on the table. Fraud, wire manipulation, and, depending on how earnings were affected, even securities violations. Still, I didn't celebrate. There was no champagne, no press conference, just a quiet dinner with my family. Kids laughing over pasta while Melissa squeezed my hand beneath the table, finally starting to believe that this chapter, this storm, might actually pass. One night, I logged into my email and found a message from Deacons. "Mr. Caldwell, your actions likely saved this company from a scandal that could have buried it. While the board cannot officially endorse your methods, know that we recognize your integrity. We are indebted." There was no signature, just those words. It wasn't vindication, but it was enough. The betrayal had unraveled. The fraud was exposed. The architects of the scheme, gone. And I was still standing. It hit the headlines 2 weeks later. Not the scandal itself, at least not in full, but enough. A brief article on a mid-tier finance news site reported executive departures at Meridian Logistics following anonymous whistleblower complaint tied to vendor irregularities. No names yet, no criminal charges, but it was out there. And once a story escapes the corporate firewall, it spreads. Within days, industry blogs picked it up. Whispers turned into speculation. Grayson's name started circulating on message boards. Clarissa's LinkedIn quietly switched to on sabbatical. A recruiter I knew texted me, "Dude, your old company's on fire. You okay?" I was more than okay. Behind the scenes, the SEC moved fast, faster than I'd expected. Turns out, Meridian had been under light scrutiny already for unrelated reporting inconsistencies. My disclosure was the final piece of the puzzle. The enforcement division launched a formal inquiry. The company scrambled, hired outside counsel, froze internal bonuses, announced transparency initiatives and enhanced audit protocols. PR speak, all of it, but it didn't matter. The board had no choice. This wasn't just about reputational damage anymore. This was federal. Then came the subpoenas. I wasn't privy to all the names, but I knew Grayson was on the list. So was Clarissa. The forensic audit confirmed over $4 million in padded invoices routed through shell vendors. Bonus structures had been manipulated. Q4 earnings had been smoothed through timing games. Meridian stock had surged after those reports. That's securities fraud. They couldn't hide it anymore. The company made a preemptive filing, acknowledging accounting irregularities under internal review. But by then, the narrative was no longer in their control. A class action lawsuit emerged within a week, shareholders demanding restitution for artificially inflated stock prices. Attorneys smelled blood. One morning, I opened the mailbox and found an envelope from the SEC. Inside was a formal acknowledgement of my cooperation and eligibility for whistleblower protection under federal statute. A second page outlined potential compensation if monetary penalties were recovered from the company or individuals involved. I didn't care about the money, not really. But it was a reminder. What I did mattered. Melissa cried when I showed her. "You did the right thing," she said, "even when it could have cost you everything." What she didn't know was that it almost had. The week after Clarissa's departure, I'd gotten an anonymous letter. No name, no return address, just a warning. People don't like loose ends. Walk away while you still can. I showed it to my lawyer. He wasn't surprised. He'd seen it before. Quiet intimidation. Nothing overt, nothing traceable, but enough to make someone think twice. But I didn't back down. Instead, I forwarded the letter to the SEC and the FBI's corporate fraud division. I kept going, kept testifying, kept providing files, documentation, meeting notes. In the end, Grayson was indicted. Clarissa accepted a deal, cooperation in exchange for a reduced sentence. She admitted to falsifying approval records and conspiring to remove compliance risks, which included me. She gave them names, dates, everything. It didn't save her job or her legacy. She'll likely never work in corporate again. Grayson wasn't so lucky. He refused to cooperate, claimed innocence until the last moment. But the financial trail was too clean, too direct. He was convicted of wire fraud, securities fraud, and obstruction, sentenced to 6 years in federal prison. Publicly, officially. And for the first time since that quiet Tuesday morning Zoom call, I felt like justice had been done. Not vengeance, not revenge. Justice. The kind that takes time. The kind you build with receipts and restraint. The kind that doesn't come with applause, but with silence and peace. And I was ready for that peace. A year later, I hardly recognized my own life. Not because it was unrecognizable in some dramatic way, but because it was finally quiet. And in that quiet, I found something I hadn't felt in years: clarity. After the indictments and press died down, I didn't go back to Meridian. They never offered, and I wouldn't have accepted if they had. Some wounds aren't worth reopening. Instead, I took a role with a nonprofit watchdog group in D.C. Small team, big mission. We investigate corporate ethics violations, advise whistleblowers, and push for policy reform. Funny how that works. They tried to erase me because I asked too many questions. Now I get paid to ask them full-time. Melissa and I moved out of Chicago. We bought a house in the Blue Ridge foothills, modest, quiet, surrounded by trees and sky. The kids adjusted fast. They loved the open space, the slower mornings, the fact that I was home for dinner every night now. Sometimes I still think about that Zoom call. The moment Clarissa looked at the camera and told me, flatly, that my position was no longer necessary. I wonder if she believed it, even as she said it, or if she'd already convinced herself that people like me were just paperwork to be managed. But I wasn't paperwork. I was a witness, and they forgot that. I kept the black binder, tucked away on a shelf in my home office, right next to a framed copy of the SEC's official recognition letter. Not because I need to remember what they did, but because I want to remember what I did. That I didn't lash out, that I didn't stoop to their level, that I handled it the way my father would have taught me, methodically, calmly, with purpose. He used to say that the difference between a mess and a system was one good notebook. Turns out he was right. I still get emails now and then, people who heard about the case, former colleagues who left Meridian and now want to reconnect, journalists fishing for quotes, even a few employees still inside, quietly working to change the culture from within. I respond to some. To others, I just let the silence speak for itself. And every once in a while, I'll get a message that reminds me why I did what I did. Last month, I got an email from a young compliance officer at another firm. She wrote, "I read about what you did. I was about to ignore something suspicious in our reporting system, but then I thought, what if I kept a copy? What if I didn't let it slide? Thank you." I pinned it to my corkboard because it reminded me that the impact of a quiet decision can echo far beyond the moment it's made. They never understood people like Clarissa and Grayson. They believed power was about control, manipulation, and image. But real power? It's knowing the truth and choosing not to weaponize it, but to illuminate it. I didn't burn the place down. I just flipped the lights on. And in the end, that was enough.